Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Pushing Film. And today's episode is going to be about scanning your own film using DIY methods at home. So if you saw my last video, which was an introduction into 2019, I talked about upcoming videos I would do about scanning your own film for especially the intention of printing it yourself. So obviously a lot of us might already get scans from our lab or have a lot of different ways of doing it, and there are plenty of ways to scan film at home, but I'm going to focus a little bit on how I approach it, especially when I need something high resolution and especially with the intention of printing, or if I'm just not happy with the scans I'm getting from other methods. So the most obvious way to scan film at home is using a scanner of some kind. And the problem with scanners is that they can range in price and ability from a few $100s to thousands of dollars. And they can sometimes scan film really slowly, one frame at a time, or they can be pretty quick and scan quite a few frames, but they might not give you as good a result. Now, DIY film scanning depends a lot on what you might already have and what you're willing to buy. But I'm going to focus on my method and show you some of the alternative options. So one of the first things you're going to need is some kind of light source, such as a little light box. Now, a lot of people do use something like a tablet or iPad or the screen of their laptop or a phone. You can actually download apps for a lot of operating systems on phones and tablets. There's one of them called Lightbox. It pretty much just turns your screen into a big white screen with a brightness control so that you can use that as a source of light to put your negative over. But I use a small light table. This one is a Logan light box that I bought from B&H, which is also where I bought the next part of this equation, which is something to hold your film. So the next important part is you're going to need some kind of negative holder. I also bought this on B&H. It was only about, I think, $5 or $6 US. Now, another option is to use the type of film holders you get with flatbed scanners. You don't necessarily need to already have a flatbed scanner, but you can sometimes buy just a set of holders on something like eBay or Amazon. And the good thing is they come in a variety of different film sizes, so you can use it for 120, 35mm or 4x5. All right, so the next thing you're obviously gonna need is your film. So I'm gonna focus mostly on color negative film because that's what I find is one of the trickiest things, and what a lot of people have a difficulty approaching is scanning color negative film. So what I've done is placed another strip of film into this holder here, which I'm gonna use throughout these examples to show you how I digitize my film using one of these. So there's a lot of different options for holders, and a lot of people just do something themselves. They tape it onto the light box or into the back of a photo frame or anything. You can get creative, but I find it's easy just to get something like one of these holders, and obviously you're gonna place that over the light box, which you're then gonna take a photo of the negative using a camera of some kind. So that brings us to the next step. You're gonna need a camera, ideally with a macro lens. Now, this is one of the parts that really might depend on what you already have, because a lot of people might not have invested in a DSLR camera or especially a macro lens. So you can use a mirrorless camera. That doesn't really matter whether it's DSLR or mirrorless. And if you don't have a macro lens, my advice would be that you can either look into investing in just a basic macro lens secondhand online, or even if you tend to already have something like a nifty 50 prime lens, there are little tubes and adapters you can get to either reverse mount the lens on your camera, which actually lets it focus really close like a macro lens would, or something like macro close-up tubes. And that way it's a cheap way into having a macro capable camera. Now, worst case, if you don't really have a camera of any kind, you can even use your phone. So the important thing is you probably want to have a phone with a decent camera that lets you override settings like white balance and have full manual control. So the concept is the same. You're just putting the negative on a light box, taking a photo of it with your phone, which I find is for quick fun conversions. I wouldn't really recommend this for converting negatives to make big prints from, but you'd be surprised how capable a phone is for doing something like this, because they can focus pretty close most of the time. All right, so the next thing you're gonna need is some kind of tripod or way to hold your camera in an upright position. So this means you're gonna need a tripod that has a horizontal neck section. That's what I use. I'm currently filming this video on my tripod right now, but that is what you're gonna need. I'll show you some B-roll of that, and it means that you can have your tripod with the camera held upright so that you can have it in one place, especially when you're scanning multiple negatives and you don't want the camera to move around. Now, a lot of people also get something called a copy stand, which is similar to this setup here, which is actually my enlarger, but a copy stand, instead of this section would allow you to put your camera there and move up and down, and it remains perfectly level, so that all you need to do is move it up and down depending on the size of the negative you're doing. If it's 35mm, you're going to be a bit closer. If it's larger formats, you're going to move it up. So I personally don't use a copy stand because I just try and use what I already have. All right, so other little things that might come in handy are having a blower just to clean your negatives. You don't want to get dust showing up on them because the methods we're using don't really incorporate any kind of dust removal like lab scanners do. And maybe something like a remote trigger, which you can connect to your camera and remotely trigger the shutter so that you don't get any camera shake, which is going to cause a lack of sharpness. Now, if you don't have a wired trigger, a lot of cameras now have Wi-Fi built in, which you can connect to your smartphone and use that as a remote trigger. And worst case scenario, if you don't want to mess around with that, I would recommend at least using the self timer in the camera, such as the 2-second or 10-second timer, so that when you press the shutter on the camera, any residual shake that's still happening would have stopped by the time the shutter goes off. And also maybe try and use mirror lockup if you're using a DSLR camera like this. All right guys, so let's move on to the method and settings that I use. So the first thing is you've got your negatives in the holder, you have your light source switched on, and you're gonna place that on top. Make sure it's nice and flat. And then maybe that's a good time to blow off any dust that you might have. I really recommend one of these rocket blowers. They can come in very handy. And then place the camera on the tripod with the next section pointing down. And the next important part is to try and get everything level. So you want to probably use live view if you have it. And then either looking at the screen or into the viewfinder, make sure that all the verticals and horizontals sort of align with what's on the light box there, because trying to get that flat is a fairly important part. I never bother getting it 100% straight, but if you're like me, you can just eyeball it well enough to try and get a good flat scan of the negative. So when the camera is up here on the tripod, you can either use manual focus and punch in on your screen ideally to try and focus on the grain of the film, or even just use the autofocus because it can often be really reliable. And if you use it on servo or continuous mode, you can update that focus by pressing the AF button every time you move to a new frame. And the next important part of that is using a good f-stop. Try not to shoot wide open at f2.8 or 4 or something like that. I recommend using about f8 to f11 because that tends to be the sharpest aperture on most lenses. A really important part of this workflow is also to use full manual mode on your camera and try and use a manual white balance. Try not to leave any automatic settings on, especially the white balance, because you don't want that changing from shot to shot, and you don't want the camera trying to overcompensate for the tint of color negative films especially. So what I also do is make sure I shoot in RAW, not JPEG. That way I have versatility to change the white balance, and having a RAW file is often a better working base for converting that negative later on. And in terms of ISO, you want to use something as low as possible because you don't want to introduce any unnecessary noise into the photo of the negative and therefore into your scan. So something between 1 and 400 is usually a good spot for most cameras. So the next step in the equation is the shutter speed. Now, a lot of this might depend on how bright your light source is. The brighter your light source is, the higher the shutter speed you can use, which means less risk of camera shake. But with a setup like this, especially because you're stopping down the lens and using a low ISO to avoid noise, it might mean using a low shutter speed, maybe between an 1/8 and a 1/30th of a second a lot of the time. And that's often what I'm working with. So that's one of the really important reasons why you want to have a steady tripod and use something like a remote release to avoid that camera shake. So what I'll often do is also combine the 2-second timer and mirror lockup on my camera so that when I release the shutter, any shake even coming from the ground or the setup that you're using doesn't come through into the photo and you get a good clean result. And in terms of exposure, I really recommend opening up the histogram if your camera has the feature, because it's going to give you a really good indication of the exposure you're going to get from the negative, and keep in mind that it might vary from frame to frame on your strip of negatives. So overall, just try and get a good even exposure of the negative and follow that histogram and try and trust the camera's light meter, except where you want to go a little bit above or below it. I'll let you experiment, maybe even bracket a few shots if you like. All right, so once you have a good exposure of that negative, the next part of the equation is inverting it. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but what I'm going to do is do a 3-part video series where in the next video, I'm going to focus on using the software called Negative Lab Pro, which I talked about in my last video. I've been given a copy for review, and I find it's one of the most effective methods to convert your color negatives especially into a good usable result that's comparable to a lab scan, if not better, especially for making big prints from. Now, if you do want to experiment with inverting your negatives using software like Lightroom and Photoshop and doing it all manually using curves, there are plenty of videos on YouTube that I've seen that can advise you on how to do that, but one of the best ones is by a YouTube channel by Sam J. Bond. I'll put a link to that. He has a really good tutorial on how to scan film at home. He uses a flatbed scanner to do a raw scan of the negative, but his method in Photoshop for converting that negative into a usable positive image is a really good one and one of the best ones I've seen, so check that out if you do want to manually invert yourself. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next part of this video, which is going to be a review of using Negative Lab Pro to convert those raw scans. Alright guys, so that's the basic summary of my method for DIY film scanning at home. Now, the more complicated and permanent your setup is, so if you actually get a copy stand and have it all set up with a station that you can regularly go to for doing this, the faster and more efficient your workflow is going to be. However, I use this method more occasionally. I still find it's good to get lab scans, especially because they're a good point of comparison for colors. So having those lab scans can be like proofing, and you can have low-res scans just to look at all your shots, figure out which ones are important to you, and then you can use a method like this for doing a high-res scan in order to print it or put it up online, or even just tweak further the colors that you got back from the lab. So if you have a lot of this equipment already, especially a macro lens and a tripod with that horizontal neck section, I would recommend giving this method a try and maybe doing some comparisons to other scans you may have gotten from a lab, or using your phone, or using a home scanner like a flatbed, and just see what works best for you. So in the next part of the video, like I said, I'm going to talk about Negative Lab Pro, and I'm also going to compare that with a few different scans. For example, a lab scan of this same frame, and then also a phone scan and a flatbed scan. So thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for that next part on Negative Lab Pro, and I'll see you guys then. Bye.